Can I take my employees with me if I transition to the RIA model? That is today's question on the Transition to RIA question and answer series. It is episode number 80. Hi, I'm Brad Wales with Transition to RIA, where I help you understand everything there is to know about why and how to transition to the RIA model. If you're not already there, if you head on over to transitiontoria.com, you can find all of the resources I make available, including this entire series in video format, audio format. I have articles, I have white papers, all kinds of resources to help you better understand the RIA model. Again, transitiontoria.com. Okay, with that, I'm excited to have my first repeat visitor on the series. And so for those of you watching in video format, you can see Rich Chen has once again joined us. Rich, nice to see you again.
Thanks so much for having me again, Brad. It's so great to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So as I said at the top, the topic we're going to be talking about today is if you were to leave your current firm, and that's kind of a broad subject, so that could be a wirehouse firm or an independent broker dealer firm, and so there's some nuances there depending on where you're coming from. Can you take your employees, your team members with you on your new path, onto your new practice? So that's what we're going to be talking about here today with Rich. I will ask him, for those of you that don't yet know him, to give him a little background in a moment. But I did just want to kind of set the tone of what we're looking to dive into today. Again, if you were to make that move, could you take those employees with you? And I will preface it, and I'm sure Rich will as well, out of fairness. He is an attorney, so we are going to be talking some legal angles to this. However, as with all legal situations, the devil is in the details. So we're going to be talking a very high level on this topic. But because every individual advisor and team situation is unique, none of this should be construed as formal legal advice. You would, of course, need to follow up with Rich for a one-on-one conversation about your specific circumstances. But I do think, as does Rich, that it's valuable that we put out this content, even at a high level, so you can generally know how this sort of thing works. But again, not specific legal advice that would require a one-on-one conversation. But with that, before we jump into the questions, Rich, for those that don't know you, if you could give a little background on yourself, that would be great.
Absolutely, Brad. So again, I'm Rich Chen. I run my own law firm practice, Richard L. Chen PLLC, and we focus on providing advice on regulatory corporate employment matters for investment advisory firms and those transitioning to advisory firms as well. So in the corporate area, we help folks launch their own RIA. We help folks with mergers and acquisitions, as well as fund formation and employment issues, drafting agreements and commercial agreements as well. On the regulatory side, we help folks with advisor registration with the SEC and states, as well as development and, if they want, management of their compliance programs, as well as representation in SEC examinations. And we also conduct mock audits for those who want that.
Yeah, quite the wide variety. For those that don't follow Rich on LinkedIn, you should. He puts out a lot of great content. It's easy for him to have just said that list of things and say he does it, but if you see his content, you will absolutely know he's a wealth of knowledge on a lot of areas of as he just described. And so I encourage you to find him on LinkedIn and follow along. And speaking of a wealth of knowledge, the prior episode I should have mentioned, he's the first repeat visitor I've had on the series. The prior episode he did with me was episode number 52, for those that want to go and take a look at it. And we discussed how to structure the legal ownership of an RIA. A lot of great information there as well. So again, episode number 52, if you want to check that out. And I've progressed a little. This is now episode number 80. So glad to have you back again, Rich, and look forward to diving right in. So kind of at a high level, and this first question is just to kind of level set here. So again, we're talking about the issue of, can I take those employees with me? However, just to level set for folks that have not dove into any of these kind of legal considerations that are relevant, can you give a high level of just some of the different topics that advisors should be aware of if they're looking to move, particularly out of maybe a more captive environment into the independent space? So obviously one of those is this employee situation, but just maybe you could list off a couple. I've done some episodes on some of these topics, but I think it'll help if you could just kind of level set the types of things advisors should be thinking about.
Absolutely. So there are three general buckets of things to think about when you're thinking of making a transition. The first one is with respect to, what clients can I take with me? Can I compete with my current firm? And that is something that can oftentimes be seen in the agreements that an advisor has with their employer. But there are a number of situations where you can take that information if your firm is part of the broker protocol and the firm you're leaving to has joined the protocol as well, as long as certain conditions are met. But that's a broader topic, which Brad has covered in previous episodes. And then there's the confidentiality issue relating to private, non-public information of customers. And there are various rules around that, and making sure to protect that information. An advisor has to be very careful about what information they take over and whether they have consent with respect to that information. And then the third bucket to think about is the duty of loyalty, right? Which is basically an advisor, while employed with their current firm, has a duty of loyalty to act in the interests of the advisor. And this may create certain situations where the transition has to take place in a certain way to make sure that the advisor is not competing with their current firm, while they're currently planning their transition. And that's why it's important to have an advisor that you can, in counsel, that you can look to help you to choreograph the transition so that you don't violate the restrictions and obligations that you have that we just cited.
Yeah, and I think what that kind of sums up is that just to be aware, again, if you're following along here, that there are these factors that need to be considered, and I often say navigated. It is a proper way you need to navigate them, and thousands of advisors have made this move prior. So I don't want to say it's a walk in the park. It's not. However, it is generally doable, but you do need to solve essentially or navigate each of these variables. And so that's why it is a wonderful thing. There's specialty attorneys like Rich that this is what they focus on. And so it just, as a listener here, be aware that there's multiple things to consider. Again, we're going to talk about just one of those on today's episode, which is this employee team member situation. So kind of extending that into also really define what we're going to be talking about. We're referring to on this episode, I guess, what I would call team members. So think of that as, maybe an administrative assistant, maybe you call it a junior analyst, a sales assistant. So we're not on this episode talking about producing financial advisors, which is kind of a whole topic unto itself. This is more almost administrative type or operational type. That's kind of a broad definition I'm trying to capture there. But Rich, any other thoughts on the kinds of positions that this would be relevant to, again, that don't fall into that producing advisor bucket?
Yeah, the titles can be different from firm to firm, but basically folks who are providing support, administrative or sales support, or junior brokers, right, that sort of work under the advisor in general. I think that's what we're basically talking about here.
Yep. And that's often critical, right, to an advisor or team that's leaving. They have these team members that are a critical part of the team, that will be a critical part of a successful transition. So very relevant to say, hey, how can I navigate, again, that path to have them still come with me? So maybe we start with the low-hanging fruit. Generally speaking, it is possible, that's what we're talking about this episode, to take team members with you. Again, we're going to get into some of the details. So generally speaking, it's possible, but is there any low-hanging fruit? Are there any scenarios where it's just an absolute hard no, it's not going to happen because of variable X? Does that exist, or is there generally always some conversation to be had?
When we're talking about employees at this level, it's generally going to be okay. I don't know if there's a hard no. Again, every situation has to be evaluated differently with respect to what agreements that the advisor has in place and things like that. But it's much more of an issue when you get to producers, and there are issues with respect to rating, which is a topic for another day. Essentially the more that the employee is valuable to the firm, by way of either special skills or access to certain trade secret information, or most importantly, if that employee is likely to cause clients to leave, right? Those are the situations that are much more likely to raise an issue for the firm and to prompt them to take an action against an advisor that is looking to take that employee to go with them.
Yep. Yeah. So no, and maybe that's a good thing. There's no maybe hard no's, but so of the yeses, and so my next question is kind of broad, and then I got a bunch of follow-up questions, some of which you might answer here in this one. We'll see. So of the more yes scenarios, what are some of the main keys that an advisor or team need to be aware of, to consider? So I'll give an example. If there's a team, and let's say there's two team members, or there's an advisor and a group, and let's say there's two team members they want to bring along for simplicity. They kind of come to you. Again, the devil's in the details, but at a high level, what are things that advisor group need to be thinking about to bring those kind of non-producing advisors, or sorry, team members with them?
Yeah, good question. So the first thing is to make sure to look at an advisor's agreements, right? Because there are still agreements out there where the advisor is restricted from taking employees. And so they're called non-solicitation of employee covenants, right? And those can be in agreements. So it's important to have those evaluated upfront to determine whether they're enforceable, whether they're reasonable, right? Basically, they have to protect a legitimate business interest of the firm, and to evaluate that in light of making a determination as to whether or not those particular restrictions are enforceable. Again, the more junior the employee, and the less likely that clients will leave with them. In general, the firms are more likely to allow those employees to go with an advisor, right? Again, but every situation is different. The other thing to think about, which is very important, is that oftentimes it can be very, very important to determine when you tell folks, even if you've decided that you want to bring them along, when to go. Because we see situations where that information is disclosed, and it leads to those employees finding out or talking to other people, where the firm may find out and ultimately expedite the transition, because they are suspicious that the advisor is going to leave, and naturally want to circle the wagons to make sure that they protect those clients, right? So it's important to think about timing as well, when even if you determine that you can, that you are willing to sort of move or try to bring along employees with you.
Yeah, and that I've seen the horror stories. I'm sure you have as well, where unfortunately that doesn't go well, right? The plans are disclosed to key employees, or maybe all employees, ahead of time with good intentions, and either you have, unfortunately, a member of the team that does not have good intentions, could be one scenario, or unfortunately, because that transition kind of lead up process is generally months in the making. Even with good intentions, that's one more person that could potentially slip and make a reference to a home office person or a client, where it might not be appropriate to have that conversation yet. And that could create issues as well. So I'm with you on that. Although generally speaking, it's hard to necessarily not talk to any team members. That would be the safest route. What are your thoughts if someone's got a team of 3, 4, 5? I mean, is it wise to maybe try to talk to one or two key folks, or do you generally say, hey, the least risk obviously is no conversations at all? I mean, how do you normally advise on that?
I think it really does depend on the situation, and depends on how much the earlier you notify employees, the greater the risk, right? But at the same time, there is a certain amount of assistance that you realize that you need as an advisor to make the transition happen, right? So, and so it may be important to disclose that your plans to those folks. There are attorneys out there who will say basically, and it is true, the safest thing is not to tell your employees until you depart. That is the legally safest thing to do, but it may or may not necessarily be practical. And and it may be worth sort of bearing some level of risk, right, to tell folks in advance. And so each situation is different, but I think those are the big factors, right? The closer to the break date that you can tell employees, the better, right? But then you also have to bear in mind that those folks may have to be involved in the transition process.
Yeah, and often are. And I guess we should clarify. And I'm kind of thinking in my head. I think, as are you, that we're kind of thinking almost that wirehouse scenario, that captive scenario. If someone's at an independent broker dealer and these are their own employees, I assume there's not necessarily any issues with having the conversations then, or does that maybe not make a big difference? Well, how do you separate those two?
I think it really depends. I mean, if they're the advisor's own employees, it seems like there's less likely to be a risk. But naturally, the more interaction you have with folks outside of the advisor's orbit, that it can create more risk. But generally speaking, those types of employees seem to me to present less risk in general.
Yeah, although the risk is always there of accidentally divulging the plans. And what I
Yeah.
always tell folks, I have a fair number of folks at independent broker dealer firms that are reaching out to me to learn about the RA model. And they sometimes use a work email address, which I write
Mm.
never use a work email address. And I
Yeah.
point that out to them, and they say, well, I'm independent. And I say, yes, that you are independent in theory. You can leave your firm, and even if they were to find out, that shouldn't be an issue. But I always say there's no need to unnecessarily poke the bear and potentially create challenges where there doesn't need to be challenges. So even in that independent space, to your point, there's still risk that as you explain it to your employees, and then maybe it's easier or less risky to do in that current independent model. Again, that's one more voice that could inadvertently share the news with folks that you're not ready to share that news with yet. So good kind of thought there. For
Absolutely.
the folks that, from a logistical standpoint, let's say again, I'm an advisor. I've concluded I am going to explain this to some of my team members ahead of time for the different reasons we just discussed. How logistically does that work? So on the day that I, as the advisor, go to resign from the firm, is it typical that the employees would resign 5 minutes later,
Yes.
kind of thing, or do they wait, or how does that logistically typically work?
Well, oftentimes they'll resign at the same time, or the resignations can be submitted at the same time.
Okay.
Again, every situation is different, but oftentimes they just basically happen at the same time.
And if they're not told ahead of time, so now let's let the pendulum swing. It's maybe not appropriate or other circumstances, but the advisor does want to hopefully bring certain employees with them, but they've concluded, again, for different factors, that they have not divulged it, so they resign themselves. Can they, once the advisor has resigned, can they immediately reach out to the employee? And again, there's potentially these, and maybe you could comment on it, do these solicitation potential challenges outlast the advisor's own employment at the firm? But obviously there's got to be a balance, because if the advisor just leaves, they want a team member to come, they can't just leave the team member hanging. So can they literally try to contact them right away, or typically how does that work when the employee's not told ahead of time?
Well, I think that at that point, the advisors, I mean, can at least notify employees that they're leaving. Right now, the issue of soliciting can be different, and you have to look at again those restrictions and whether or not you're sort of comfortable with them. But basically, you can let the employees know that you are determining to transition to another firm, And generally speaking, that should not violate the restrictions on solicitation of employees itself, right? So I think once you transition, generally you should be able to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And does it make any difference? You mentioned earlier the topic of rating, which kind of we could probably make a whole episode, maybe we'll at some point here make a whole episode on where rating comes in.
Mm.
But at a high level, is there any concerns of how many employees you might take? And that's probably a loaded question because a lot of variables involved. But if I'm an advisor and I have one employee, that's a different scenario than if I'm a larger advisor group and we have 5, 6, 7 employees. Is there any kind of limit to how many team members you should arguably try to take? And again, that's a loaded question that's going to be tough to answer, but any thoughts at a high level?
Yeah. So there's no hard number, but generally, the more of an impact that the folks you're taking with you will have on the current firm. And again, that's mostly folks, that have special skills that are hard to replace or who have, client relationships that are likely to leave. That's more likely to trigger a claim that you are rating the current firm, right? And we can get into it another time, but rating is not itself a specific legal claim, but it oftentimes is born out of tortious interference or interference with the current firm's business or unfair competition practices, right? So, but by and large, the more employees you take, it's not. It can be, I guess, to some level, the number, but it really, I think, is more focused on what the impact is to the current firm.
What roles those folks were playing? Yeah.
And
Okay.
most importantly, probably for the firm, how sort of how many clients are likely to go once those employees go to.
Yeah. And so here's to a degree, this is you taking maybe your legal hat off and just the hat of business owner yourself,
Mm-hmm.
but also having had a lot of conversations with advisors about this topic. Again, this is maybe not a legal question, thoughts on advisors that strategically want to take some employees and maybe they're using this as an opportunity to not take other employees, and maybe those were employees that were assigned to them that they choose not to take. So there could be some awkwardness in that. I don't know, maybe even some legal considerations and want to be careful about how things are messaged. So again, maybe not a legal question, but any thoughts on, let's say you have 5 members on the team and you want to bring 3 with you and 2 you don't.
Yeah, I don't think that it's so much of a legal issue. I think the bigger issue, you can decide you want to take certain employees or not. Generally, employment is something called at will, right? So basically, you can decide to hire and fire employees or not take them with you when you want. But you may have to manage some of the issues with potentially backlash, right? And you have to think about that. If you are leaving certain employees behind, that may create resentment and potentially the opportunity for those employees to report back to the firm things that they uncover if you haven't, necessarily planned well, or things that could create a potential claim that firm may become aware of because you have a dissatisfied employee who isn't brought along to the new firm.
Yeah, and hopefully those are few and far between, but I could certainly see where that can create challenges. We won't name the firm, but there's a firm well known for having one advisor and one sales assistant in the office, and the sales assistant's typically hired by the firm and kind of placed in the office. And if that relationship is not well between the advisor and sales assistant, yeah, there can be those scenarios where we'll just say you're not all playing on the same team at all times. So certainly some tricky situations that thankfully don't impact most advisors or groups, but it can be relevant. So just appreciate your thoughts on a tough question there.
Sure.
Nearing the bottom of my list here. So some advisors, and again, in my world, it's all folks kind of heading into the RA space. Some advisors leave wherever they're at to start their own RA. Others, and there's a number of compelling value propositions out there where advisors join existing RIAs instead. How does what we're talking about here in any more specific one-on-one advice you would give, does it make a difference between those two scenarios? Does it change the advice, or is it relatively the same?
It doesn't necessarily change the advice, but there may be certain things that you can look to. If you're going to another firm and you want some level of comfort or protection, you may, as part of your negotiation as an advisor to join that new practice, say, hey, I need some cover in the event that I want to take these employees. Are you willing to bear some or all of the legal costs, right? If somehow the old firm comes after me. So you might be able to negotiate that if you're joining a new firm. And so that may be one of the things that you can benefit from if you're doing that.
Okay. And that will depend, of course, on the structure of the firm you might be joining, whether they're a traditional W-2 firm or a 1099 firm. There'll probably be different answers to that question, but it could be relevant indeed. And then the kind of last question before I wanted to get in some kind of things I always like asking about to help people if they want to reach out to you, so besides just contact information you'll see here, but at a high level, and maybe this is a topic for a whole different episode, but just to kind of plant the seed of another thing advisors should maybe be thinking of is if they do all these things we've talking about and they bring team members with them, oftentimes this would be the first time an advisor themselves will now be responsible for having their own employees. They previously, if they were a large brokerage firm, I mean, we could use the verbiage that, that administrative assistant or sales assistant's quote unquote your employee, but technically they're an employee of the large brokerage firm. Now in this possible future state, particularly if the advisor has their own RIA, their employee is literally an employee of their firm now. And so again, this is maybe a topic for a different episode, but just to plant the seed, is it typical that at that new firm, among all the different things you might set up for that new employee, obviously payroll, benefits, things like that, that you would also want to have an employment agreement put in place with your new firm and these team members that come with you? I assume that's pretty typical, but thoughts to maybe plant a seed for a future topic we could discuss as well?
100%. So, and thinking about employment issues, while not typically sort of on the forefront of what most transitioning advisors think about, is still important, right? Whether you hire someone as an employee or an independent contractor, and that could be a whole topic in and of itself. You want to have an agreement memorializing the terms of those agreements, including whether or not you, as an advisor, launching your own firm, want to impose restrictions on those folks taking clients or taking employees with them, right? So it's important to memorialize those relations in employment agreements. But it's also important to think about the employment laws that will impact your practice, right? So, while there are, securities laws that impact your advisory practice, there are also employment laws, and it's important to be aware of those. In certain situations, you may want to have an employment handbook that lays out what employees are expected to do and to refrain from doing. So we help folks to put together employment agreements where that makes sense as well. So so this is a very important topic that should not be ignored when looking to launch your own firm.
And so to kind of set we're going to finish with asking for your contact information for people that want to talk to you about it. I do like setting for my audience to try to help them just kind of know what to expect. So if an advisor were to call you up, reach out to your team, reach out to your office, whether they want to talk about today's topic or some of these other variables we've kind of touched on briefly, how does a consultation typically go? I mean, does that start with just a kind of an introductory call with you or someone on the team, and you kind of determine whether you're a fit for each other, and then you engage and then take next steps? Or just to kind of set the tone, what happens if an advisor or group reach out to you or your practice to kind of dive into these topics?
Great question, Brad. So folks are welcome to reach out to me anytime. I tell folks that I am happy to have a conversation, whether or not folks retain us. Ultimately, I enjoy providing helpful guidance, and naturally, we can only provide legal advice once we're engaged. But I'm happy to think through and talk with advisors, especially because this can be a very scary process, right? And there are a lot of legal issues to think through. But we try to help break it down for folks so that it's a bit easier to understand. And as Brad said, folks do this all the time. And in vast majority of situations, there are no problems as long as a well choreographed path is followed. But basically, once folks reach out to us, I have an intro call with them, and it's me that does that. And we just sort of talk through the advisor situation, their goals, and then sort of help them to chart a course for their transition. And if they decide, typically we can't get into too many details before we have an engagement letter. But once we have an engagement letter, we basically will help the folks that want to engage us to chart a course. Looking at their employment agreements and their other sort of policies that they have at their current firm, and then evaluating the laws that are applicable to sort of their specific transition. And then if they're launching a firm, to help them to go through the steps of forming an entity and drafting commercial agreements, client agreements, employment agreements, as we talked about, and just basically help them to navigate that process as much as we can.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of your value proposition, is that you also help them know what they don't know, or ask the questions they don't know to ask. Or they might come to you with a specific question or a couple questions, and you can help them with that. It's also, oh, by the way, have you also thought through X, Y, and Z? And so there's a lot of value in that, because that is kind of part of what makes this a scary process. And that's a lot of what I do for advisors too, is say, okay, it doesn't have to be a scary process. The reason it's scary is because there's a lot of unknowns. So you need to lean on people that will help you become aware of what you don't currently know to be asking in the first place, and then how to solve for those things as you kind of work through the process. So I know Rich is fantastic at that. I've known him a couple of years now. Wonderful resource. So for advisors or teams that want to reach out and ask about today's topic or kind of any of these other things, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Well, they can go to my website, which is www.richardlchen, my first name, middle initial, CHEN.com, or you can email me anytime. My email address is rich@richardlchen.com. Always happy to be a resource. And as Brad said, I look at our role as basically being a guide. If you're going to climb, not that this is like Everest, but if you want a guide, right, basically to help you chart the course, right, and to think through the things that you may not necessarily be aware of, that's what we do here.
Yeah, and I will include that contact information in the show notes. So reminder, this is episode number 80. I will have the in the show notes, and you can also head, which would be in podcast notes, the video notes, if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you head to, again, transitiontoria.com, you can find the entire video series. Just look for episode number 80, and you will be able to find that contact information. So Rich, with that, as was the first case, again, folks, go check out, if you liked what you heard here, episode number 52. Rich did a wonderful job there as well, talking about how to structure the ownership of an RIA. A lot of great information there as well. So it's always great to have you on, Rich. You might at some point be my third time visitor. So if that happens, I'll thank you in advance. But thank you for coming on today.
That would be great, Brad. As always, great joining you, and thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks now.